Thank you. I'm really happy to be here, and what I'd like to do is start with a photo. Let's see. There we go. That way I can remember it. So, as mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about this emergence of a new role, which is Product Manager of Growth. How many people here have heard of growth hacking? All right, so most of you, not surprising, there's a lot of hype around the term. So really what I want to do today is kind of cut through the hype. You're not going to hear me referring to it as growth hacking. What I'm really going to be talking about growth in is in the context of product managers. Some of the things that we're going to be talking about is, what is the difference between, let's say, a product manager of growth versus a classic product manager. And then we're also going to go ahead and cover the process that you can follow, because I'd say that the main difference between a classic PM and a growth PM is a classic PM is really shipping features to meet a need, right? To meet a user need or a market need. Whereas product manager of growth is really shipping experiments. It's very much an experiment-driven process where you already have product market fit with your product. Now what you need to do is grow specific metrics within the product. So I'm going to be introducing you to a framework that'll show you how to do that today. And then lastly, we'll talk about some of the objections that you may encounter if you already have a growth role within your organization or you plan to create one. As far as questions, I was thinking we'd get through it at the end. So let's go through it. And also, guys, this is the first time I've given this presentation, so hopefully it'll be clear. But if not, we can cover it in the Q&A. So my background is I'm one of those people that's been doing product for longer than I care to remember. I actually started my career in 1997 at SGI, formerly known as Silicon Graphics. Not even sure if they're still around anymore. And basically from there, I ended up working my way through a couple of name brand companies in the product organizations as well as startups. Co-founded Growthhackers with Sean Ellis, who some of you may have heard of. He had a blog called Startup Marketing Blog, and then we went on to create Growthhackers together. And then just prior to Growthhackers, co-founded and sold a company called Qualitative, which some of you may have heard of. It's a micro-survey product that allows you to run in-product surveys without knowing a user's identity in order to get feedback. And then also spent some time working my way through the Index Ventures portfolio. And that was a really great way of getting a lot of experience with different types of business models. I worked with e-commerce companies. I worked with B2B companies and SaaS models, as well as marketplace models. Probably my growth highlight was working with a company called Jackster, which at its peak of 2007, 2008, it was a voice over IP app. We grew the user base from 500,000 to 5 million in less than 6 months without any marketing budget. That was with one of the co-founders of LinkedIn at that company. So I really got a chance to learn firsthand when I was there a lot about this experimentation-driven process, looking at the data, understanding your user behavior, and then leveraging it to be able to just make things grow. And what you're going to be seeing today is my opinion. I want to state this because there's a lot of articles out on the internet about growth hacking is BS and whatnot. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what you call it. If you're going to be a successful business, you're going to have to grow. It's pretty much that simple. And if you don't grow, you're either just going to go out of business or you're going to become an acqui-hire. But if you actually want to build a business that returns investment to the investors, the shareholders, to yourself as an equity owner, if you're at a startup, you have to figure out a way to grow the business. I think that we've already covered this in the intro. So let's talk about what we're not going to be covering today. So we're not going to talk about specific growth hacks and tactics. By way of conversation and narrative, we may end up touching upon a couple, but I'm not going to be sitting here saying, okay, here's 10 things that you can do to get a better landing page. We're not going to be covering that today. We're also not going to be talking about specific user acquisition channels like SEM, SEO, or content marketing. And then we're also not going to cover the basics of A/B testing. The assumption here is going to be that you know the basics of A/B testing, and if you don't, there's lots and lots of resources out there. Optimizely, which hopefully some of you have heard of, if not most of you. They are an A/B testing software platform. They really have some great resources about A/B testing and whatnot. So why is there this PM of growth role? So I want to start here with a quote by a gentleman named Andy Johns, who was, he's currently VP of Growth at Wealthfront, which is a financial services startup up in Silicon Valley. But before that, he headed up growth at Twitter, Quora, and Facebook. In my opinion, pretty impressive resume. I mean, these are all companies that have really, really they saw explosive growth. And he kind of defines this growth role as what finance is to the money in and out of the business. Your PM of growth or your growth marketer is responsible for users and customers coming in and out of a product. So because of that, just the same way that finance needs to be managed, you have to manage growth. So really, it's because of the internet that you now have so much data to work with. In non-internet business models, it was a lot harder to get the data. Maybe by the time you got the data, there was too much of a lag time to be able to act on the data. That's not the case with internet business models and internet products. In this case, you're getting data oftentimes in real time, and certainly you can work with data within the last 24 hours and in the last week. So because of that, it really requires specific skills and experience in order to be able to leverage that. And as a result, you can't necessarily expect that maybe a classic PM would have it. Classic PM might be comfortable with understanding the data, but may not necessarily understand all the different analytics tools that are out there that they can be using to get access to data faster. And then finally, like core product management, growth requires constant focus and attention. Especially, let's say, like in a viral model. With viral models, you have exponential growth where you're adding users at an exponential rate. But if something happens, like you have an email deliverability problem, or one of your main vectors or segments of users all of a sudden stops using the product, you actually start to see exponential growth in the opposite direction. It's very rare that you just go from growth to flatline. Generally, you're going to see a growth, and then you're going to end up seeing it go down, kind of like a shark fin. That's usually what it's going to end up looking like on a graph. So because of that, there needs to be a responsible person for this. It can't be something that's just an afterthought to your regular product manager who's trying to ship the core product. It can't necessarily be somebody who's maybe your marketing person who's in charge of marketing spend and ad campaigns. There needs to be somebody who's looking at all the analytics that are happening within the product every single day and understanding what are the objectives that we need to achieve as a company through this product and setting out a roadmap. So I wanted to show you a couple of examples just so that you guys know that this PM of growth role is real. So this is actually taken off of Uber's website, literally 4 or 5 days ago. Product manager of rider acquisition. I ended up just taking some highlights, but maybe just take a moment to kind of look through how they describe the role, what they describe as the qualifications and requirements, and then maybe pay special attention to the last 2 boxes. I'll give you guys a few seconds here to just review that. Okay, is there anything about the last 2 boxes that stuck out to anybody? And if so, maybe what was it? Does that feel like a classic PM role when you look at those last 2, or does it feel like it's maybe an extension of the classic PM role? Anybody? All right, no takers, so I'll talk about it. So the reason why these 2 bottom ones really stuck out to me is, number one, you'll see that they really demand that you're comfortable with getting data. It's not uncommon, especially in Silicon Valley, that the people that are heading up growth, oftentimes, they know SQL really, really well. If they need to get access to the data, if they can't get it through their third-party analytics package, they're just going to go into the database themselves and run their own queries. And then as far as the email master, the reason I took this out as an example is because in this case, this is about somebody who's trying to move the acquisition metric. And email is, I guess, one of the things Uber's discovered is email is an important channel for that. As a result, they want to make sure that whoever is going to be heading up this group and this task force to drive acquisition, you need to be comfortable with email. Not because you're an email marketing manager, but because you literally can have an idea and, if necessary, configure that campaign yourself without talking to any other department. And I think that's one of the things that you're going to hear me cover today is this autonomy from the rest of the core organization, whether it's the core product development organization or the core email or marketing organization. You're going to find that really the most effective growth teams are truly autonomous from the rest of the organization. If they have ideas, they can ship those ideas literally within an hour or that day. And the trend is growing. Again, this is from Indeed.com. I just typed in product manager growth San Francisco, and this is just a snapshot of just some of the roles that came up. All right, so let's spend a minute then talking about that classic PM skill set versus PM of growth. So in classic PM, I'm defining it as they identify opportunities to deliver and expand products' value proposition, oftentimes through features, versus the PM of growth, who's identifying opportunities to convert, activate, and acquire users through product touchpoints. So they work side by side. Now, in some organizations, you'll see a PM, let's say, shifting between those two. And I think that you can do that when you're earlier stage, but I think that at a certain point, once you have product market fit and you're really ready to scale the business, it's probably time to make sure that each of those have their own owner. Classic PM ships features, PM role ships experiments, and then as far as how their performance is measured, classic PM is generally measured by their ability to ship a product that satisfies the needs of users and market, versus generally measured by achieving lift or reduction, let's say you're trying to reduce churn or bounce rate, of a conversion rate of a desired goal. But what they both have in common is they both use data to inform their decisions about crafting a roadmap and a strategy. So how well does the classic PM skill set translate to the PM of growth? One of the things that I hear a lot is, I'm a classic PM, I want to go into growth PM role. And you know what? The answer is that it really depends. In a PM of growth, you have to be very, very comfortable with analytics. Hopefully nowadays, most product managers are. However, what I've seen is that most classic PMs tend to fall into two different categories. One category are PMs that are very comfortable with user experience. They're very comfortable with crafting the user journey, the customer journey, probably a little bit more of a right brain thinker, versus other PMs that I've met, like for example, PMs at Facebook or Uber, Twitter. These are going to very much be data-driven, PMs. These are people that probably did very well in their statistics classes when they were in college. What's interesting, though, about that growth PM is you're also going to have a good understanding of the psychology of influence. What is it that motivates people to behave the way they do? So, for example, what is it about the Instagram app that gives the dopamine rush so that you decide, you know what, I'm going to take another picture through Instagram? What is it about making sure that that push notification that says somebody just liked your tweet, that says, it's like the Pavlov's theory, right? It's like you have to understand that when the bell rings, the dog starts slobbering, right? I mean, we don't want to think of our people that way, but the fact of the matter is that it's science, right? I mean, at the end of the day, the users here are the subjects, and what's happening is that you have growth teams that are effectively designing products and experiences to influence the way that you behave and interact with that product. They're going to have a very broad skill set that spans across marketing, product, and operations. And I think that Marty touched upon that. You're going to start to see that a lot of the stuff that Marty Kagan talked about will be coming through here as well. You got to know that if you're in a SaaS business, for example, and you're part of the growth team, you're going to have to be very, very comfortable with what you can do with the Salesforce API. And if you don't know what you can do with the Salesforce API, you're going to have to be very comfortable reading documentation and ideally even being able to write your own API calls just to be able to understand what you might be able to do with Salesforce, because there may be things that you can do in the product that then alert the sales team, because maybe the sales team has told you or you've seen data that if you can call somebody within 1 minute of them filling out a form, you have a 90% chance of getting to the next step of the funnel. And then you're going to have to be familiar with several tools that allow rapid execution. So you saw that in the Uber description. In this case, email, landing page creation, and surveys. Growth PM should feel comfortable in all of those at the very least, if not more. And then finally, comfortable with taking risks and imperfection. When you're shipping things this quickly, you have to be very, very comfortable with the fact that it's not that perfect user experience that you may have envisioned. And I think that maybe is another difference with classic PMs. A lot of times classic PMs, they know exactly what they want to ship. They're going to work as hard as they can to get as close to that as possible. Whereas when you're designing experiments and tests, the same way that you have a minimum viable product when you're shipping product, it's really minimum viable test. What is the smallest thing you can do to see whether or not you can get users to behave in a certain way? So let's talk about a framework for identifying growth opportunities. So here's a quote from my co-founder, Sean Ellis, who was formerly growth at Dropbox, Eventbrite, and LogMeIn. So at least 40% of your users should say that they would be very disappointed if your service or product went away overnight. At every one of those companies that I mentioned, Dropbox, Eventbrite, LogMeIn, Sean Ellis ran this survey to users. And all the survey asked was, how disappointed would you be if this product went away overnight? Would you be very disappointed, somewhat disappointed, indifferent or neutral, or wouldn't mind? And then all he would do is look at the people that answered very disappointed. If you answered any other way, he didn't even care who you were. He didn't even care what that segment size was. All he wanted to do was find who are the most passionate users of this product. And now let's reach out to talk to them and ask them, well, why would you be disappointed? And because of that, what he is able to find out is he was able to find out what is it that makes those passionate users come back and use this product habitually. And I think that this is a really interesting misnomer, because I think a lot of times the instinct is to try to understand, how do I convert the behavior of the users that aren't doing the behavior that I want? This is a little bit of a twist, because in the growth role, it's really about, how do I double down on the people that are doing what I want? Because they're the ones that are going to tell me, there's one feature in your product that matters to me. Well, then let's learn what that feature is, and all we're going to do is change all of the messaging on the homepage. We're going to run a bunch of tests that message the product only on that one value proposition that I know the most passionate users all felt. Is versus my product can do 10 things, and the reality is the most passionate users care about one thing that your product does. So the other thing I think that is important before we dive deeper into the framework is you have to know when it's time to grow. This is, I think, probably the biggest problem when you're talking about a startup or a new product. You don't want to grow the product until you already have product market fit. And I know that this is a term that's been thrown around. Hopefully folks know what it means. Mark Andreessen has a great blog post on product market fit that's from many, many years ago. You know, and as far as, you know, do you know when you have it? It's kind of a bit of a gray area. Sean's method is make sure that you have at least 40% of your users that identify it as this must-have product. I'd be very disappointed if it went away. But you also have to have strong retention cohorts. So you want to make sure that, you know, when the users get that dopamine rush to use your product the next day, well, what does it look like 30 days later? What does it look like 60 days later? What does it look like 90 days later? You need to know that you have the retention. And the reason is, and I, you know, have here just kind of the classic stages of a startup. You know, here on the left, customer development. You're just trying to solve the problem. You're doing a bunch of series of MVPs to see if you actually are solving something people care about. Then finally, you're going to be out there talking to the actual customers. Now you have a couple of people that are paying for your solution. And then finally, when you know that you actually have people that are like, yes, I will pay for this product today, or they hopefully are already paying, that's when it's time to think about growth. And then what you want to do is work backwards from the one metric that matters. How many of you have heard of this term, the one metric that matters? Sometimes it's referred to as the North Star metric. All right, so a couple of people. So the one metric that matters is, if you're going to rally the entire organization from the CEO all the way down to the front lines of customer support and the people sitting in finance, usually there's one metric that everybody in the company can relate to. So I'm going to go to the bottom and then we'll kind of work up to the top. But for example, depending on your business model, if it's a SaaS business, it may be what's called MRR, or monthly recurring revenue. You know, if you're a Facebook or an app or a community, it might be your daily active users. For you know, e-commerce, it's lifetime value, and I've put in a couple of examples. For Airbnb, it's nights booked, right? That is the one number that every single person in the company is expected to know within 1 hour of walking into work in the morning. And then for Uber, it's rides taken. And the reason is because that is an indicator that whatever they're doing is working. So you want to work backwards from the one metric that matters. When you're coming up with that growth strategy, you want to make sure that it's driving that one metric. If it's not driving that one metric, it's probably the wrong type of experiment to be running. It's good to know that, again, different one metrics that matter for different businesses. You also should know that it should change depending on where you are in the life cycle of the business or the product. And then finally, ideally, that one metric that matters is aligned with where you deliver product. Notice that in the example of Airbnb and Uber, nights booked, that's where they're delivering value. Rides taken, that's where they're delivering value, not only to the guest, but to the host, not only to the rider, but to the driver. So developing a growth model. So growth model captures the elements and levers that influence how your one metric that matters, that influences your one metric that matters. And there's three elements: the top of the funnel, the aha moment, and the must-have experience. And then there's 5 levers: acquisition, activation, retention, referral, and revenue. Now remember, this is my opinion. This is actually based on Dave McClure, a presentation that he did many, many years ago. I want to say maybe 10 years ago, called startup metrics for pirates. There's a URL there at the bottom, or if you Google it, you'll find it. Regardless of whether these levers work for your business or not, you will have levers and you will have stages of a funnel in your business and your product. So talking about those three elements, the top of the funnel is the ability to capture traffic, convert it to taking some kind of action. So for example, I got them to land on my page, now I want them to sign up for the white paper. Or now I want them to create an account. Or now I want them to download my app. The aha moment, a simple action tied to an emotional reward. That's that rush of dopamine. It's that kind of, oh, that's kind of cool, right? You need to know that there's a point in your product. So for example, in Uber, it might be, I install the app, I put in my credit card, now I'm ready to go ahead and get my first ride, and the second that I push the order of the ride, up comes a map and I can see the person who's going to come pick me up. I think the first time any of us saw that, we were like, well, that's better than catching a taxi. So I think that that's an example of an aha moment. And then the must-have experience. So when the continuous value that the product or service, it transcends from being a nice-to-have to a must-have. That point where a user says, you know what, I'm not even going to bother hailing cabs anymore because the Uber experience is so much better than hailing a cab. All I do now when I know I need to get somewhere is I just go ahead and open up the Uber app. So let's just talk about the 5 levers for a second. So acquisition, users come to the site or app from various channels. So activate is users enjoy the experience. Generally, that correlates to your aha moment. So I want to make that clear. Activation is not the user signed up for an account. That's a vanity metric. You can track how many people signed up for your account, but if you've never activated them, who really cares how many users signed up for an account unless you really believe that you can spam them with a bunch of emails to get them to come back and activate later. Retention, which is users come back repeatedly, and generally that's an indicator that you've created a must-have experience, albeit it might be a must-have experience for a small segment of users to begin with. Now let's double down on that segment to see how we grow it so that more people have the must-have experience. Referral, so users like the product to refer others. That's really, really important. How many people learned about Google from an ad? None of you. Nobody learned about Google search engine from an ad because they weren't spending any money on ads. And it's the same with Facebook. In every single case, a lot of the companies that grew the fastest, it was because they had created a great experience, but then what they did was engineered referral loops so that people would either tell people because qualitatively it was such a great experience, or in the case of Facebook or LinkedIn, because you're going to scrape somebody's address book and say, hey, I'm on this service and you should use it and here's why. And then finally, revenue. You got to make money. Again, if you don't figure out a way to make money, you're either an acqui-hire or you just go out of business. So how it all comes together, you can see that you have a funnel on the left, acquisition, activation, retention. Then you have this referral loop that goes back into the top if people do get to the must-have experience. And then finally, the output is revenue. So let's talk about the process for evaluating and prioritizing these growth initiatives. So at this point, I have product market fit. I now know that my product is ready to scale. I have customers, ideally, a few customers that are ideally paying me, or I have a critical mass of users that have downloaded, used the app, and I have good, strong retention cohorts. In other words, I'm ready to pour fuel on this fire because the fire has started, as opposed to pour fuel on a pile of sticks and I don't even have a spark to get it started. So this is a quote from Brian Rothenberg, who heads up growth at Eventbrite. And we've all heard this before, and this I think goes for classic PMs as well. It's knowing when to say no. Usually the PM is the no person, or the project manager is the no person. If sales is the yes person, PMs are usually the no person. The growth person needs to be a no person as well, because you're going to have a million ideas from your CEO all the way to your customers. They're like, oh, you guys should try this. I think you'd grow a lot faster, or we should do this, or we should do that. And at the end of the day, it's that growth PM who's going to be the guardian of, well, what are we actually going to work on? What is the hypothesis? What is the data behind that hypothesis? And how does it rank against the other ideas that we have? So that growth roadmap starts with analyzing and learning. So you can hear a lot of echoes of that Marty Kagan conversation this morning. Be an observer. Discover what's happening. Become obsessed with the way that your users are behaving. And if there's something that you want to know and you can't get to it from your analytics, you need to instrument it. If there's something that you're like, if I just knew that, I would understand so much more, figure out a way to build in the instrumentation for it. Then you need to form ideas from what you've learned. When you look at how users are behaving, what am I starting to learn from that? Finally, you're going to prioritize that list of ideas, and then you're going to run experiments against those ideas. And those experiments are either going to validate the idea, meaning, you know what? You're onto something. Let's figure out how to do the next iteration of that experiment. The same way that in product development, you come up with a feature idea, and if you see that your users are using that feature, you're going to iterate on that feature. So analyze, learn, and set objectives. And again, Marty talked about OKRs. That's really the objectives that we're talking about, because you're going to see that your objectives need to be time-bound, and they need to be correlated with an expected result or a key metric. So quantitative and qualitative methods will be used to analyze your users, to learn their behavior. That's the data. Some examples of quantitative sources are Google Analytics, Mixpanel, Amplitude. There's lots and lots. And then in the case of qualitative sources, it would be things like Qualaroo, my old company, which was microsurveys without having to have the user's email address. User testing, where you can actually have users ask, literally have user testing recruit people from across the world or from a certain segment of users to say, I want a video session of how they use my product or how they use this feature. Find out where the friction is. When you see let's say I learned from my data that a lot of people don't upload a profile photo. But I also know from my data that if they do upload a profile photo, they have an 80% more likelihood of being retained at day 30. Well, let's figure out how to upload a photo and why people aren't uploading photos. So surveys, usability testing, these are things that might give you that moment of like, okay, I get it. I can see why. It's because nobody understood that the edit profile button was the button you had to push in order to upload your photo. So let's run some A/B tests where we rename that button, upload your photo. So set those objectives, expected results, time-bound. So ideally, like for example, we want to improve the satisfaction of our user. We want to double the satisfaction of our users this quarter, right? So that might be your objective, and your key result is moving your net promoter score from 50 to 80. I guess 40 to 80 if we said double. So forming those ideas. So in a classic PM role, what are those ideas of features that you're getting from your customers or from your own head? Here, what are those ideas that are going to allow you to grow your business? Leverage the data. And then each idea needs to be backed up with a hypothesis. This is not an art. There may be an art to it when you get really, really good at it, but at its most core, this growth process is scientific. This is everything everyone in this room learned in kindergarten when you learned about the scientific process for the very first time. You're going to watch things happen in the world, and you're going to form ideas, and then you're going to design a test to test whether or not your idea or your understanding is correct. So because of that, you have to make sure that you have good hypotheses behind your ideas. There needs to be the variable that can be modified, the quantifiable result that you can measure, and then finally, what is the rationale that allows you to connect the outcome to the theory? So here's a statement that I took from Optimizely. Every hypothesis, good hypothesis, should have if variable, then result, because rationale. And here's an example taken straight from Optimizely of strong and weak, and I'm going to let you guys just take a moment to read the difference between the two. So for me, what really stands out as the difference is, number one, you'll see that in the strong, they quantify what they expect is going to happen. They quantify 20% as opposed to, I just think good things will happen. I actually think that good things will happen to 20%. And then the reason why they did 20% wasn't just because they made that number up because they thought that they'd get a raise if they said, oh, it's going to be 20%, and everyone's patting each other on the back saying, yeah, if you guys get that, you're amazing. The reason is because they already had their heat map software tell them that I can see that 20% of users do this, so therefore if I can get users to do that at twice the rate, I'm going to end up seeing growth. So now you have your list of ideas, you have some good hypotheses behind them, it's really a backlog of ideas. Now what you need to do is prioritize them. So what we do to prioritize is we use something called an ICE score. Again, for PM, even ranking features, a lot of similarities here. ICE is impact, confidence, and ease. So impact, what is the impact that I could have on the business if this works? If I can get 20% more people to install the app and add their credit card the first time, how many rides, taken will that translate to? How confident am I about the outcome, or the team is confident? Usually confidence comes from you saw it work at another company, saw it work for one of your competitors, maybe you've run a test before and you know that it worked, so you have higher confidence that it's going to work again. And then finally, ease. This is really important. How easy is it to develop that test? Does it require developers? If it does, it's probably not that easy. If you can just do it like a subject line test for email, very, very easy to run. You're going to open up your email program, you're going to set up an A/B test in MailChimp, and you're going to try 2 different subject lines, and you'll know the results tomorrow. As versus, hey, we want to kind of tweak the user journey through the funnel. That's probably going to involve a developer or 2. And then what you're going to do is average the score for your I, C, and E, and higher is better. So the higher the score across those 3 variables, that's probably the ideas that you want to be able to test first. So here's an example of a list of ideas from our company. I didn't make this up. I just screen grabbed it from our own backlog. So you'll see here that it's sorted by the score on the far right, made up of impact, confidence, and ease. So let's talk about experiments for a second. There's 2 types of experiments. There's experiments to learn, which is I want to understand what user intent and behavior is. And then there are experiments to optimize. In this case, I already feel like I have an understanding of what my users do. Now what I'm ready to do is design tests that actually get them to do something so that it optimizes the metric. So a couple of examples of experiments to learn. Google AdWords. You're trying to figure out what the value proposition is of your product. Well, one great way to do it is start to run some Google ads with different headlines and different value propositions and see which one gets the most clicks. Chances are the one that gets the most clicks is probably the value proposition that's either the most appealing or that people understand. And that's a lot better than put your homepage out there and wait 10 weeks for 2,000 more people to visit it and then try to draw conclusions. And then what I call the 404 test. Now this you have to have an appetite for. I personally do, but some people don't. Make sure that your CEO does. The 404 test is, I have an idea for a feature. I want to introduce the ability to send free SMSs anywhere in the world from within my feature. And to do that, I have to partner with an SMS company, and I have to make sure I have global distribution, and I know that it's going to cost me this much money per SMS sent. That's a lot of development. That's a lot of budget. I don't even know if my users want to do it. So how am I going to test if they actually want to do it so I can forecast how many users would use this? I'm going to go ahead and say, try our new feature, send an international SMS. And I'm going to create the form that's going to allow you to send the SMS. But you know what? I'm going to stick a beta label on there because I'm not going to deliver a single SMS message. And I'm going to let that run for about 24 hours. And then I'm going to pull the plug. Why? Because it was only in beta. We were just testing it. What did we learn? Well, we learned that in 24 hours, 10,000 people sent an SMS. This was a real-world test that we did at Jackster. It was only once we could forecast why that feature was important, how it resonates with our users, how we could make money, what type of deals we need to negotiate with our SMS partners. It was only after we ran this test that we actually went out and started to do the real work of putting that entire feature together. Experiments to optimize is boosting funnel performance. So, this is classic. If you're e-commerce, let's improve the funnel, let's improve the landing page, let's improve the shopping cart page, let's improve the recommendation engine at the bottom of the product. And then steps in a viral loop. So if you're trying to grow an app or you're trying to grow a social network or a marketplace, you're going to be doing a lot of A/B testing around all of those steps of, hey, tell a friend, or if you have another property, property owners, let them know about our service now. So examples of tools for experimentation, you have Optimizely for A/B testing, Unbounce for A/B testing landing pages, MailChimp and other ESPs for A/B testing email subjects, and homegrown tools. It's not abnormal when you get to a certain size. You're just not satisfied with what you can get off the shelf anymore, and you'll end up building it homegrown. I see this in a lot of larger companies. It doesn't really matter what tools you use, and lots of these tools have a free version to get started. As the growth PM, you should be excited about trying these new tools to find out, can they allow me to run tests faster without involving developers? And if they do, it's probably a really good tool. And then you have to remember to go ahead and track your experiments. So here is an example of us tracking our experiments. We basically break it down to what are the experiments we're going to be running next, what are the experiments that we're actively running, and then finally, what are the experiments that we've now finished, and now we're just waiting for our analysts to go in and do the deep dive on the analytics so that we can, they can tell us what we learned from it. So you have to record your results. Now I've run my tests. What was the bottom line? There's going to be quantitative results and the lessons learned. And the three conclusions in general break down. It's pretty simple. It either worked, it didn't work, or it was inconclusive. You know, not really sure if we learned anything. We thought we learned it, but then we dived deeper into the data and we realized that we really weren't sure, so we're just going to call it inconclusive. As versus, it totally worked. We did an A/B test with subject lines and we doubled our open rate by changing the subject line to include this, you know, in the title. To, it didn't work. We tried the subject line test and you know what? It didn't make a difference. And then what you want to do is build a knowledge base of what worked. This is your lab notebook. You're not going to meet a scientist in the world that doesn't record all of their results, make them available, and even when that scientist leaves the company, they leave behind the lab book. That lab book belongs to the entire team. It belongs to the entire company. It should not be in somebody's head or somebody's email box. It should be recorded in either a system of record or a shared spreadsheet. If it's in a file, it should hopefully be a Dropbox or a shared folder, but I can't emphasize enough that you have to have a knowledge base of what worked. Because what's really going to frustrate everyone on the team is when you expand your team and you hire new people, and the first thing they say to you on the first day on the job is, you guys should try doing this to your homepage. And it's like, oh, well, we tried that. Well, what happened? I mean, eliminate that entire conversation by telling somebody for their first day on the job, you should spend nothing but spending 2 days looking through our knowledge base to familiarize yourself with what we've tested, what worked, what didn't work, because if anything, that's going to make them look through fresh eyes and say, you know what, I can see why that homepage test failed. I think we should try it, and here's my hypothesis why. Then you also want to enshrine your winners. If it wins, tell the core product team, guys, we got to change the new customer journey. We did a test. We found out that it works. Now everybody should be going through this journey. And then finally, learn from the losers. You know, we lost something, and the problem is that you'll never get that time back again. So make sure that at the very least, you memorialize what was it that we learned from this so that we don't end up doing something similar again and losing the time. And this is an example of experiment results as we capture them. This is an example of our knowledge base. You can see it worked, it didn't work, it's inconclusive. So you want to stay organized and focused the same way that you have sprints for product development. We think of growth sprints. You're going to queue up your backlog, and ideally you have a cadence. Our cadence at Growthhackers is we run 3 tests per week. And that's very, very important. If we didn't run 3 tests per week when we do our weekly growth meeting, there better be a really good reason why we didn't do 3 tests that week. Now, we have enough traffic that we can do 3 tests per week. And you always want to be testing because, frankly, if you're not testing, you're not learning anything. It means that you're just building a bunch of stuff and you're going to put it out there. And there's a time to build. If you have pre-product market fit, it's all about building and talking to users and building and talking to customers. But when you're in growth mode, you should be experimenting all the time because if you're not experimenting, chances are you're not learning or you're not learning as much as you could be. And you want to have that weekly growth meeting that's led by the PM of growth. Our weekly growth meeting is every Tuesday at 11 a.m. We never miss that meeting. And the reason we did it on a Tuesday is because holidays happen on Monday. We wanted to make sure that there's never a reason for anybody to meet that growth meeting. Now, in our case, the growth meeting is an expensive meeting, so we keep it to 50 to 60 minutes. It has a very tight agenda. I'll share an example of one that we use. And then you also want to make sure that you have that documentation. If it's not through a system of record, you should have a template. Excuse me, some kind of Google Doc, and it's really an experiment doc. It's that classic scientific document. So here's that example of a growth agenda. We spend 15 minutes reviewing our KPIs and growth metrics, that one metric that mattered. Did we make a difference? If we have an objective right now, how are we doing against that objective? Then what we're going to do is we're going to review last week's growth sprint. What were those 3 tests that we wanted to run? And are they running? And have some of them stopped? And if some of them haven't started, let's understand why. Is it because we have a resource constraint? Is it because we learned something new? Then what we do is we actually have an analyst that joins us in our growth meetings. So what he does is he then spends 15 minutes taking us through the key lessons learned from the experiments that we ran. Now, in my opinion, a good analyst is not somebody who just runs reports. I've met 2 types of analysts. I've met the analysts that are just really good at, you tell me what type of report you want, and I'm just going to run the report for you. That to me is not a good analyst. A good analyst for me is a storyteller. They're not going to lead with the numbers. They're going to lead with, so guys, this is really interesting. Let me tell you what happened, why I think it's happening, and then I'm going to show you the data that backs up everything that I'm telling you. That, to me, is like the world-class analyst that when you hire, don't let them go. And then we select the experiments that we're going to be running in next week. And then finally, we review the growth idea backlog. Everybody should always be formulating ideas. So you want to be able to keep track of how many new ideas are coming into that backlog week to week. Here's an example of an experiment doc. So let's just go into advice for overcoming challenges in growth teams, because really, you got to get buy-in from across your organization. This could be very disruptive because you're effectively taking over some things that up to this point, your traditional product team was probably responsible for. So their gut instinct might be to be very protective, but I can tell you right now, if you don't figure out a way to grow the business, it doesn't really matter what your title is, nobody's gonna have jobs 6 months or a year later. So you gotta get buy-in. Basically, you gotta get buy-in at the very least from every one of those executive heads, because you're gonna be touching sales if it's a SaaS business. You're gonna be touching ad sales if it's a consumer business. You're gonna be touching the customer support and ops people, because if you're running a test and they didn't know about it, they're gonna have people writing in saying, why isn't my SMS working? You know, and they're like, what SMS? I didn't even know we have an SMS feature. Well, that's because they didn't know you were running an SMS feature test. Ideally, you're gonna have your CEO. What we've seen at Growth Hackers is that when we talk to people that are the most successful in growth, their CEOs are passionate about growth. Mark Zuckerberg's a great example. So just very quickly, best growth teams are cross-functional. You're gonna have a PM of growth. You're gonna have a growth engineer. That means a dedicated resource. You're gonna, to help you tweak and build new features to test. You're gonna have a designer who embraces the idea of results trumping great design, and access to a copywriter or analyst is needed. Doesn't necessarily have to be part of the core team. And then as far as growth engineer, it's really a story of self-sufficiency. I can guarantee you that anytime you want to run a growth experiment that requires development, you will never, ever, ever convince somebody that a growth experiment trumps shipping a feature if shipping the feature is what's been promised to your investors or your partners and whatnot. The best way to solve it is make a case for having your own growth engineer. And then as far as finding a great PM of growth, look internally and externally. The skills that are required are on the left. A lot of them we've already covered. And then on the right, these are the nice to haves. So if they don't meet every bullet on the left, I wouldn't even consider that person for a growth role. And then if they have anything on the right plus everything on the left, probably a very good hire. And then you, like I said, anticipate tension with the core product team. You're taking away something that used to belong to them. So one way to fix that is make sure that your heads of product or all your PMs are in that weekly growth meeting. And then finally, make sure your analytics are in order. If you haven't instrumented your funnel, don't run any A/B tests. You got to instrument your funnel first. You can't manage what's not measured, so if it's not being measured, don't try to manage it. And then again, share those wins and insights. Did it work? Send an email to your entire company or post something on Slack and tell people the results. Get them excited about the fact that the company is earning $20,000 more per hour because of an A/B test that your team ran last week. Or it didn't work, but you know what? We learned something really, really valuable. People don't care about black cars or pink cars or whatever it might be. And then, just a recap is growth is a process and it's a culture. It needs to be managed, and that's the reason why I believe that you're seeing this PM of growth role emerge. Somebody needs to own everything that I've just talked about for the last 40 minutes or so. So let's go ahead and open up for questions. I think we probably have about 5 or 6 minutes. I was hoping to have a little bit more time. Any questions? Okay. You guys can also shout them out, and I can repeat the question if you like. That's how I can hear you. Yeah, so the question was for the ICE score, do we weigh, when we do an average, is it a straight average or a weighted average? Do we give more weight to impact, confidence, or ease? There's no right or wrong way. We personally don't, but that's because that's what works for our organization. because of the people we have at the growth meeting, because we have a pretty good idea of what we feel like, the team is pretty aligned on what we're confident about and what we think is easy. But you got to figure out what works for your company.
How do you balance the quantitative results and the qualitative feedback? What if there's like conflicts between the two?
So the question was, how do you balance quantitative and qualitative? Again, I don't know that there's right or wrong answers. I mean, in my mind, quantitative is what's happening, and qualitative is starting to give you insights into why it's happening. I think the main difference is quantitative feedback, you can have statistical confidence. So scientifically, you can make a declaration that certain things happen because of certain things. I think that with qualitative, it's more open-ended, right? That gets into the psychology of users. So I think you just need to, again, that's why it's a PM of growth role. There needs to be somebody who feels very comfortable striking the balance between quantitative and qualitative, and they have the leadership attributes to be able to make cases to convince others that, this makes sense.
So I have two questions. One is, what internal tool do you guys use to just analyze the experiments and have everybody sort of on board? Because for the growth team that I had, we essentially used Trello, but we set it up so that we can see what's going on now, next, et cetera. That's the first question. And the second question is, ideally, how have you structured your team and how big is essentially your organization? Because I think that some organizations have 100+ members on the team, and I just kind of want to understand a little bit on that.
Sure. So this will probably be our last question because there's a lot packed in there, and I think we only have a couple minutes left. So the first question was about tool, or what I call a system of record. So there are systems of records you can use to track this entire process. You can use Jira, you can use Trello, you can use a shared spreadsheet, you can use PowerPoint. What I had screen grabs of, I will shamelessly tell you, is a product that we developed at Growthhackers that we're just now starting to put out there. It's a purpose-built product so that entire teams can collaborate around the growth process. If you're interested in trying it, you go to growthhackers.com and you'll find, somehow you'll weave your way to links. As far as the second question about team size, we're only 15 people, but in the case of our weekly growth meeting, we have 5 people there. So 1/3 of our team is there. And it's pretty much, head of engineering, head of design, head of data, myself on the product side. As far as larger companies, what I've really seen happen a lot of times is that they'll break out companies into things like, let's say, in a marketplace, eBay, you're going to have a team that all they're responsible for is growth of buyers, and then you're going to have another team all they're responsible for is growth of sellers. Uber, drivers and riders, Airbnb, hosts and guests. You just end up having these, you just keep making your team smaller and smaller. Then you can break it into steps of the funnel. I just have one team that all they do is focus on acquisition. I have another team that all they do is focus on referral loop, right? So you can just keep breaking it down and down so that you just end up having that ownership and that understanding at every step. I think probably one more minute for a quick question. Sure. So the question is, when you have a team that can really only focus on building and shipping product, how do you make the case for a growth team? I think that, yeah, so I think you have to find the resources. If there's a commitment at the CEO level, I'd mentioned ideally you get buy-in at the CEO level. The CEO will figure out a way to get money for that growth initiative if that's what it's going to take to get the business to the next level. If you can't get the budget to hire the people, chances are it's just going to become sort of an afterthought or a hobby for everybody, and you should adjust expectations of the results accordingly. And guys, I'll be hanging out here. I'm happy to answer questions. I know we had a couple more, but I don't think we're going to get to them. So thank you very much.